Exactly what caused this accident. If it turns out to be the thermal protection system, the shuttle tile, you bet we're going to do whatever it takes to beef those up before we return to flight.
7 world-class astronauts, a multi-billion-dollar spacecraft, and a 3,000-degree firestorm. Nothing was supposed to survive the fall from 200,000 feet. However, after the disaster, searchers found something that forced NASA to face a gruesome question. What actually happened to the bodies of 7 souls on board? The answer is chilling. To truly understand how this tragedy unfolded, we have to look back to the moment the laws of physics turned against the crew during their final violent descent home. The physics of high-altitude disintegration. The disaster actually started 16 days before re-entry, but the crew had no way of knowing their wing was compromised. As the shuttle hit the atmosphere over the Pacific, a hole in the left wing became a gateway for this unforeseen disaster. Superheated air, glowing at 3,000 degrees, began pouring into the wing like water through a broken dam. This gas is what scientists call plasma, and it acts more like a blowtorch than air. It didn't just heat the wing up, it literally started eating through the aluminum supports from the inside. At this point, the shuttle was still moving at 18 times the speed of sound, unaware that its skeleton was melting away. As the wing grew weaker, it started to warp. This change in shape created a massive amount of drag on the left side, making the shuttle act like a car with a stuck brake. For a short time, the flight control systems worked overtime to fix the problem. The computers fired thrusters and shifted flaps to keep the nose pointed forward. Eventually, the aerodynamic forces became too powerful for the machine to handle, and the computer reached its limit. Instantly, the orbiter fell into a violent, hypersonic flat spin. This was not a gentle roll. It was a brutal spinning motion that created massive centrifugal forces inside the cabin. These forces were so intense that the crew likely suffered from immediate disorientation. At these extreme speeds, the atmosphere acts as a solid wall rather than thin air. As the shuttle continued to tumble and yaw, the wings and the tail section were stripped away by the sheer force of the wind. This left the crew module, known as the forebody, isolated and tumbling through the sky on its own. It was a heavy, pressurized shell falling from 200,000 feet. The cabin was never built to survive a solo flight or the extreme friction of the open sky, and very quickly, the hull began to fail. The air-conditioned, safe environment where the astronaut sat was suddenly gone, replaced by the lethal thermal environment of the high atmosphere. Most of what is known about these final moments comes from the OEX recorder. This device was discovered months later in the Texas mud, and it somehow survived the fire and the impact to tell the story. It tracked everything from the air pressure to the temperature of the sensors until the very end. The data shows a steady and tragic drop in cabin pressure, marking the moment the walls finally failed. This recorder gave investigators a clear map of how the machine broke apart in the silence of space. While the shuttle was falling apart in the sky, the true horror wasn't just the physics of the machine. It was what those forces were doing to the human beings inside, the 5 lethal events. In 2008, NASA released a document called the Spacecraft Crew Survival Investigation Report. It is a heavy clinical read that outlines exactly what the 7 astronauts went through. The investigators looked at every piece of evidence to find out exactly how the mission became unsurvivable. They identified 5 specific lethal events that occurred in the sky over Texas. These events happened so fast that they overlapped, creating a situation where survival was impossible. By looking at these stages, we can see that the crew wasn't dealing with one single problem. They were facing a stack of deadly situations that happened in a matter of seconds. The first lethal event was the loss of cabin pressure. This is a terrifying reality of spaceflight. Even though the crew wore pressurized suits, they weren't fully sealed. At the time, NASA rules didn't require astronauts to have their helmets down or their gloves locked during the re-entry phase. When the cabin wall finally failed at roughly 200,000 feet, the air vanished. This caused the crew to lose consciousness almost instantly. And because the oxygen was gone, they were essentially asleep before the most violent parts of the breakup even began. They didn't have to experience the worst of what was coming next. As the shuttle continued to tumble, the second event took over. This was the mechanical lethality of the spinning cabin. Once the cabin separated from the rest of the shuttle, it began to tumble through the air at incredible speeds. The astronauts were still strapped into their seats, but the movements were so violent that their bodies were thrown against the interior of the craft. Experts call this the dynamic loads phase. The force of the cabin slamming and jerking around caused fatal injuries before the ship even began to melt or fall apart. The restraints that were supposed to keep them safe became part of the problem because the tumbling was so chaotic. The third stage was separation trauma. This happened as the cabin itself began to fall apart under the pressure of the wind. The seats and the floor structures failed, and the crew was physically pulled away from their restraints. At this altitude, the wind is moving at thousands of miles per hour. When the astronauts were pulled away from the protection of the cabin, the sheer force of the wind and the loss of their seat restraints caused immediate lethal trauma to their bodies. And because there was no longer a vehicle to protect them from the elements, these astronauts were now falling through the thin, freezing upper atmosphere entirely on their own. For those falling toward the Earth, the fourth event was hypersonic exposure. Even if someone had survived the spin and the pressure loss, the environment outside was a nightmare. There is almost no oxygen at that height, and the friction from the air creates extreme heat. Normally, human tissue cannot withstand the combination of high-speed wind, lack of air, and intense thermal energy. And by the time the remains began the long fall toward the ground, the extreme conditions had already done their damage. This part of the descent took several minutes, but the life-ending injuries had happened much earlier in the timeline. The final event was ground impact. This is the hardest part to talk about, but it completes the story. Gravity eventually brought everything down to the surface. Even if a person had somehow remained inside a protected part of the shuttle, the speed of the impact with the Earth was much too high for anyone to survive. At the end, every safety net NASA had in place was bypassed by the sheer scale of the breakup. With the breakup complete, the mission shifted from a rescue to a recovery operation of unprecedented scale across the American South. The search for the fallen. You see, the debris from Columbia didn't just fall in one spot. It created a massive trail that stretched over 2,000 square miles, reaching from East Texas all the way into Louisiana. This was a giant puzzle scattered across some of the toughest terrain in the country. So, to find the shuttle and its crew, the government launched the largest foot search in history. It wasn't only about technology or satellites. It literally came down to thousands of people walking in long lines through thick woods and muddy swamps. They had to be incredibly careful because they were looking for tiny pieces of a spaceship and the people who flew it. Well, the human side of this search was truly massive. Over 25,000 volunteers showed up to help. This included people from FEMA and the Forest Service, along with local residents who knew the land. These searchers walked shoulder to shoulder, moving slowly through briars and tangled vines to make sure they didn't miss a single thing. It was exhausting and emotional work. Many of these volunteers had never seen anything like this before, yet they stayed out in the cold and the mud for weeks. They were driven by a deep sense of duty to bring the astronauts home to their families. Most of the crew members were eventually found near a small town called Hemp Hill, Texas. And even though the debris field was huge, the remains of all 7 astronauts were located within a relatively small 5-mile radius. However, finding them was a heavy moment for the search teams. NASA had a very strict and respectful protocol for these discoveries. So whenever a searcher found remains, everything stopped. They would cover the area with an American flag and stand watch in total silence. They stayed there as an honor guard, protecting the site until the official recovery teams could arrive to take over. Also, the local community in East Texas faced a very difficult reality during these weeks. Many people found pieces of the shuttle or human remains in their own backyards and farm fields. It was a shocking experience for families who were maybe having breakfast when the disaster happened over their rooftops. The psychological weight of seeing such a tragedy up close was immense. These citizens became an essential part of the recovery, calling in discoveries and helping searchers navigate the dense piney woods. Their help ensured that the recovery stayed organized and respectful despite the chaos of the first few days. As the items were gathered, the process of sorting began, and everything was sent to the Vehicle Assembly Building at the Kennedy Space Center. 84,000 pieces of the shuttle were eventually recovered and cataloged. Workers had to carefully separate the human remains from the twisted metal and scorched tiles of the ship. This was a delicate task that required a high level of focus and care. And as we all know, every small fragment was important for the investigation. But finding the fallen was only the beginning. The task of identifying them required the most advanced forensic science available in 2003, Dover Air Force Base and forensic science. Once the recovery teams finished their work in the fields of Texas, the mission moved to a very secure location in Delaware. Basically, the remains were flown to Dover Air Force Base, home to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. This is the same place where the military brings home fallen soldiers, so the staff there already had a deep understanding of how to handle such a somber task with dignity. The goal was clear yet difficult. Scientists had to officially identify each person so they could be returned to their grieving families. Because of the extreme nature of the accident, this wasn't a standard procedure. It required a team of the best forensic experts in the country. The identification process used a combination of modern science and old-fashioned records. Experts worked around the clock using DNA sequencing, dental records, and even fingerprints where possible. This was a slow and careful process because the trauma to the bodies was so severe. They had to be absolutely certain of every result. At the same time, searchers in the field were finding personal items that helped tell the story. They recovered rings, mission patches, and even a flight log that was partially charred but still readable. These artifacts were cleaned and treated with incredible care, serving as a physical connection to the people who had been lost. But then, a very specific effort was made for Ilan Ramon, who was the first Israeli astronaut. NASA worked closely with Israeli authorities and religious leaders to ensure his recovery followed Jewish law. In a move that felt almost like a miracle, searchers found pages from his personal diary scattered in the Texas mud. Despite falling from the edge of space, the damp pages were still legible. The diary entries were filled with his thoughts on the mission and his connection to his home. This recovery allowed the Israeli people to bring their hero home for a proper burial according to their traditions. More so, the medical findings at Dover also provided some much-needed closure for the families and the space agency. The autopsies confirmed the details of the lethal events we discussed earlier. Specifically, the evidence showed that the crew was unconscious before the most violent parts of the shuttle's breakup. This meant they did not suffer during the final moments of the descent. So, knowing that the astronauts were essentially asleep before the worst happened was a small but significant comfort to those they left behind. It changed the narrative from one of prolonged fear to one of a sudden, painless end. After all the work was finished, NASA made sure each astronaut returned home the right way. The agency coordinated with the families to arrange for burials with full military honors. This was the final duty NASA owed to its crew. These ceremonies took place across the country and in Israel, honoring the bravery of the 7 who took the ultimate risk for science. The families were finally able to lay their loved ones to rest, knowing that everything possible had been done to bring them home. Amidst the tragedy of the crew, a bizarre biological miracle was discovered among the wreckage that challenged our understanding of life's resilience. Miracles and macabre findings. While searchers were still scouring the Texas countryside for debris, they stumbled upon something that seemed impossible. Inside a locker from the shuttle, they found several small canisters containing microscopic roundworms known as C. elegans. These tiny creatures had been part of a biological experiment on the mission. Surprisingly, even after falling from the edge of space and enduring the hellish heat of re-entry that destroyed the orbiter, the worms were still alive. They were found weeks later, wiggling in their containers as if nothing had happened. This discovery stunned the scientific world and raised questions about how such fragile life could survive when everything else had been lost. Well, the reason these worms lived while the human crew did not come down to basic physics. Because the worms were so small and light, they didn't have much mass to create heat as they fell. They were also tucked inside specialized experiment lockers that acted as a secondary shield against the fire. For a human, the size-to-mass ratio is much larger, meaning that the friction of the air turns a person into a lightning rod for thermal energy. The worms essentially floated down through the atmosphere like dust, while the heavier parts of the shuttle were torn apart by the intense pressure and heat. Searchers also recovered a roll of film that became one of the most haunting pieces of the puzzle. When NASA developed the footage, they saw the crew in the final minutes before the disaster. The astronauts were laughing, having a drink, passing a camera around, and marveling at the glow of the atmosphere outside the windows. They were doing their jobs and enjoying the view, completely unaware that the wing was already failing. This footage provided a deeply human connection to the mission, showing the crew in their final happy moments before the silence took over. However, other findings from the wreckage were much more difficult to process. Investigators found evidence that certain switches on the control panel had been flipped in ways that didn't match the automatic flight plan. This suggested that for a few brief seconds during the initial emergency, at least one crew member was awake and attempting to stabilize the ship. This goes back to the helmet issue. At that time, NASA had a low-risk re-entry protocol that didn't require helmets to be sealed. Because their suits weren't airtight, the drop in pressure happened too fast for anyone to finish their emergency checklists. There were also reports regarding the recovery of individual organs, such as a heart found in the debris field. While these details are grim, they reflect the clinical reality of what happens during a high-velocity impact. When a craft disintegrates at Mach 18, the physical forces are so extreme that the human body cannot stay in one piece. These findings were difficult for the recovery teams to handle, but they were necessary to understand the full scope of the violence the crew faced. But then, these grim findings didn't just provide closure. They provided the blueprint for a safer future in the stars. The legacy of survival, the hard lessons learned from Columbia, changed the way we travel into space forever. Today, as we look at the Orion capsule and the Artemis missions heading back to the moon, we see the fingerprints of the STS-107 crew everywhere. Engineers now use a cabin-as-a-lifeboat design. This means the crew module is built to be a standalone survival cell that can protect the astronauts even if the rest of the ship fails. This shift moved us away from the fragile design of the shuttle and toward a much tougher, more resilient way of exploring the cosmos. Also, safety is now built into the clothing itself. The new Orion Crew Survival System suits are a far cry from what was used in 2003. These suits are designed to stay fully closed and pressurized from the moment the astronauts sit down until they safely dock. This removes the risk of the sudden pressure loss that took the Columbia crew by surprise. Besides, NASA also ended the era of guessing about ship safety. Now, every single mission involves mandatory high-resolution inspections of the wings and heat shields while in orbit. No ship comes home until we know for sure that the hull is solid. Additionally, this legacy even reaches as far as Mars. The thermal data gathered from the tragic failure of Columbia's wing is used by scientists in 2026 to model how landers enter the thin Martian atmosphere. By studying exactly how that aluminum frame melted, we have learned how to build better heat shields for the future. At the Kennedy Space Center, a permanent memorial called Forever Remembered keeps their story alive. It features pieces of the shuttle and personal items that remind us these were real people with families and dreams. And the Columbia crew gave everything for the stars, and their legacy lives on in every safer launch that follows. What part of the Columbia legacy resonates most with you? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. For more content like this, tap on the next video on your screen.